Deuteronomy 33:29. Happy art thou, O Israel, who is like unto thee, O people saved by Yahweh, the shield of thy help, and who is the sword of thy excellency. And thy enemies shall be found liars unto thee, and thou shalt tread upon their high places. Call halal Yahweh B'Shem Nawashai B'Shem Rakakwadash. Double honors unto the apostles, double honors unto the elder bishops. Salutations to all my fellow laborers doing this work in truth and sincerity, risking their lives and their freedom to do so now more so than never. To the scattered elect that are scattered around the four corners of the earth, among the heathens that look like the heathens, the Israelite foreigners, the speckled birds, and to the Akwath that are listening and learning, to you I say Shalom. This is your brother Malcolm from the branch of the Great Millstone here in Chicago, coming at you another lesson in truth. And the name of this video is Proof Ancient Egyptians Were Black During 1974 UNESCO Conference. All right. And this is Dr. Cheap Anta Diop. All right. And this is a video where I'm really just going to allow it to play, because they cut Esau. They prove Esau to be a liar, to be a racist, hateful deceiver that he is, and how he just completely tried, they tried to whitewash history. And I don't know what made them think that they'd be able to hide this forever. Okay? Yeah, you can trust nothing from these people. They're just liars. Physicians of no value. Let me grab another scripture, and then I'm going to let this play. And I was going to grab 2 Ezra 6, and start at 27. And it reads, "For evil shall be put out, and deceit shall be quenched. As for faith, it shall flourish. Corruption shall be overcome, and the truth, which hath been so long without fruit, shall be declared." Without any further ado.
Conference on the peopling of ancient Egypt. Now, I want you to listen to this very carefully. After many years, more than 2 centuries, in which European universities and academics have stated that Egypt is Caucasoid, or it is Semitic or Hamitic or Afro-Semitic or Afro-Hamitic, eventually they invited Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Obenga. This is the first time at any international conference on an intellectual matter that Africans are invited to deal with their own story. Theophile Obenga, he wrote me last week. This is the first time I'm hearing from him, because apparently Diop left a lot of papers after he died, and so several people in France and French-speaking Africa suddenly become aware of the journal for the first time. Theophile Obenga is an expert on Bantu. He's head of the Bantu Research Institute in Brazzaville. He's a great linguist, like Diop. And they appeared at this conference. Everybody else was European or Arab, from the Arab Republic of Egypt. And at this conference, everybody came unprepared except the 2 Africans. Could you imagine that? This is a conference meeting, an academic conference meeting to discuss the peopling of Egypt, and these guys arrived empty-handed, talking from their heads. The Africans arrived with heavily researched papers. The linguistic evidence of Diop was so startling that everyone had to admit this is one of the revolutionary things that Diop and Obenga, particularly Diop, had proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that Egyptian language was not Semitic or Hamitic, it was African. But there is where the agreement ended, because when Diop tried to show that not only the language was African, but that the people were African, everybody got upset. And those people who couldn't say that it is not so, they said, we mustn't talk about race anymore. We are all human beings here. Let's stop talking about race. So let me read you the passage from my introduction which deals with this. A summary of this conference is of interest and of value to readers since it reveals the state of Egyptology at the moment and the defensive reaction to the question of blackness or Negroness. Professor Galab of the Arab Republic of Egypt declared that the human race during the Paleolithic era, which is the Stone Age, was more or less homogeneous and Caucasian, meaning to say all human beings were first white. This is an Egyptian, you know. And that Negroes only began to appear much later. A Negro culture, he claimed, did not appear prior to the Neolithic, that is the age of agriculture. Professor De Bono of Malta spoke of a race of pyramid builders coming into Egypt, a race with Libico-Asiatic affinities, without even deeming it necessary to show where on this earth stands the proto-pyramid that this race constructed before it migrated to Africa. How could you have a race of pyramid builders who never built pyramids anywhere else? Several participants, finding it difficult to demolish Diop, decided instead to demolish all talk about race. Professor Saf Soderberg of Sweden, while demonstrating that the majority of Neolithic cultures in the Nile Valley belong to the techno-complex of Saharan and Sudanic cultures, said the concept of race was out.
Okay, I'm forced to interject right here. He said, how could you have a race of people come in to build pyramids? This goes to show you the extent that these white people would do to try and solidify their lies. But you had a race of people came in to build pyramids and never built pyramids anywhere else. And then the pyramids that were built here in the Americas had the exact measurements that the ones in Egypt had, proving that it was the Israelites, that the Northern Kingdom came to here to the Americas. You see, what you have to understand is that when you're looking at these dark flesh Egyptians, and this was not only in northeast Africa, but all the way up into what the world calls, into Mesopotamia, what the world ignorantly refers to as the Middle East today, all the way into Asia, as far as Russia, the people were melanated. They were dark-complected people. Not the same race, but they were still dark-complected people, all right? Because color isn't the race, all right? And what it really comes down to is that the Bible clearly breaks down and lets you understand that the nation of Israel came to be among the Egyptians, mixed and mingled among the Egyptians. The Bible tells you that certain Israelites were mistaken for Egyptians. Even the Israelites themselves at one time, when they were burying some of their dead, were mistaken for Egyptians by other dark people. Moses was mistaken for an Egyptian. Paul was mistaken for an Egyptian. Who the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ, he, his mother, and his father hid among the Egyptians. All right. So this was all to solidify, to try to support the lie, the deception of the 1948ers, of the small hatters. All right. Because this proves that this evidence right here simply proves that they are not the people. All right. They just opened up a tomb just a couple years ago, and all the images were like the ones you're looking at on the wall, and it was a 5,000-year-old tomb that had never been touched. So you have to ask yourself, where is Benjamin Netanyahu? Where is he and his people in this? They weren't there. They didn't come until after Ptolemy took over, which was came out of which was one of Alexander's generals. All right, that's when the so-called white people actually took over, Egypt, and started dressing as the Egyptians, and just the same way that they became Australians, that they became Americans, that they became Britons, that they became Irish and Dutch. They became anything and everything they could do to not be identified as Esau Edom. All right, because Esau Edom is cursed in the Bible, and this is just the time of their exposure. All right, and they simply are being made naked. Let me grab one quick scripture with Jeremiah 14:2, which describes the tribe of Judah. It describes their flesh, not the gates, as someone ignorantly said once. But this is Jeremiah 14:2, and it reads, Judah mourneth, and the gates thereof languish, meaning they have no leadership. All right. They are black unto the ground, and the cry of Jerusalem is gone up. All right. Once again, once you look up that word black in the Hebrew, because every word in the Bible is numbered. All right. It's either going to be H, whatever the number is for the Hebrew, or G, whatever the number is for the Greek. And that word there was kadar, which means dark skin. So it was literally talking about their skin. Lamentations 4:8, is talking about their skin, their appearance. It says they're blacker than a coal. All right? Than a coal. You know what a piece of coal looks like? Meaning that they were just dark fleshed. All right? So let's let them continue.
Molded and should now be abandoned. After he showed that the technology of the early Egyptians is Sudanic and Saharan, which is African, he said, don't talk about race. Race is outmoded, must be abandoned. Professor Vorkut of France, insisting that there was no way to tell how many of the Egyptians were white and how many were black, felt the evidence nevertheless showed that Egypt at least was African in its way of writing, its culture, and its way of thinking. Now just imagine that. You can't tell how many white people are there, yet everything they're doing is African. In other words, they're white Africans. These white Africans, their language, you said, is African. Their culture is African. Their science is African. And yet you can't tell whether they're white or black. Professor Shinny of Canada said that Herodotus and all the Greeks and Romans who called Egyptians black were merely being subjective like Dr. Diop. Race was not a scientific concept. Professor Mokhtar of the Arab Republic of Egypt said the problem of race was unimportant. Professor Abdullah of the Sudan, after chiding Diop for adopting an Africanist approach to this problem, went on boldly to assert that Egyptian language belonged to the family of Proto-Semitic languages and that there was abundant evidence to prove it. He had not come to the conference, however, with his abundant evidence. This, in fact, was one of the remarkable revelations of this international conference. In its final report, UNESCO pointed out, quote, listen to this, although the preparatory working paper set out by UNESCO gave particulars of what was desired, not all participants had prepared communications comparable with the painstakingly researched contributions of Professor Sheikh Anta Diop of Benga. The Africans at last had done their homework, and those theses, which had once seemed formidable, now shook with the fragility of leaves and the new intellectual wind blowing from the continent. All the time they had had their own way until they had become intellectually flabby. This is one of the things that I have noted. When I was in Arizona some years ago, I had to fight with someone they called an expert on Mexico. And when I opened up on this guy, I realized that I wasn't fighting an equal, that he couldn't fight because he'd never fought in his life. We have to fight. We have to fight for every inch of ground. Nothing is yielded to us without a struggle. But they always took it for granted, as my mother used to say, they're born with golden spoons in their mouths. And so when at last he met a fighter, he couldn't fight. When I started on him, I suddenly realized, I said, animals, when they fight like apes, etc., when they're about to overpower you completely and they realize that you are losing, the ape pulls back. Man doesn't usually pull back. And there is something Christian in me which said, you got him on the ground now, let him go. And there's something devilish in me that said, let him go, my foot. He has trampled us for said. These are the kinds of men who have destroyed us for centuries. They are still destroying us out.
Those were Japhetic images you were just looking at on those vases. These right here. Those are Japhetic images.
The time has come to kick these people when the knowledge arises.
He's right.
There is no compromise here because we are dealing with something savage and brutal. It is impossible to become involved in black history without becoming involved in politics. because to reconstruct the history of black people anywhere in the world, you have to fight against a climate of great prejudice.
A white man that I've worked for, if he's alive today, he's a little with a capital L. His name was Gad Steiner. I asked him about some books on the African people in ancient history. And in the language of the South, he let me down slow. I mean, he spoke kindly. He said, you know, John, I'm sorry that you came from a race that's made no history. But if you persevere, if you obey laws and study hard, you'll make history someday.
Words be smoother than butter.
I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those were the only books there were. Everyone else seemed to agree.
In terms of scholarly debates, we know of the work of Sheikh Anta Diop, and he's played an important role in verifying the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians. Robin, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Professor Sheikh Anta Diop was a scholar from Senegal. And why he's important is that he wrote a book called Nation Negre et Culture, but the English came out as The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality. That book came out in 1974, and because it was now in English, it attracted a very wide interest. In that book, Professor Diop presents essentially part of his doctorate thesis. And his doctorate thesis was not just that the ancient Egyptians were black Africans, but also that other African culture can be related to ancient Egypt, in much the same way that European culture is related to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, same idea. Now, what Diop presented was, first of all, he went through the various classical scholars. Now, the classical scholars are the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, and he presented 10 examples where they described the ancient Egyptians. And then if you go through some of the examples, there's an ancient European scholar called Herodotus, who was an ancient Greek scholar. He said the ancient Egyptians had black skins and woolly hair.
Now, we believe Herodotus was an Israelite, all right, because they completely ignore the fact that, that Negroes, so-called Negroes, Israelites, were among the Romans and the Greeks. And most of their greatest thinkers were actually Israelites and not Caucasian Greeks and Romans, converts, because they really were Esau, Edom, newly converted to Greek, and then from there to Rome. All right.
Lucian says that the ancient Egyptians were too black, then describes them as having thick lips and bandy legs.
Yeah, so they discredit all their own scholars, their own people, that were eyewitnesses to the different accounts, which is why in Snowden's book, Blacks in Antiquity, he makes that statement about how relics like the one on the cover of this book by Dr. Diop are more important than the written word, because the relics tell a story where the word tells lies. Their written word tells lies.
Other scholars, Diodorus Siculus, suggested that the Egyptians actually descended from the people of what we would now call the Sudan. And when we examine our 10 scholars...
The Egyptians are descendants of Ham, all right? They're Hamitic. Ham had 4 sons, all right? And the Egyptians were Mizraim, one of Ham's 4 sons.
They paint quite a detailed picture of what did the ancient Egyptians look like. Then Professor Diop went in search of positive proof, and what he did was he had access to a series of mummies that were excavated by a gentleman called Mariette.
Listen closely.
And the Mariette excavation mummies, Diop removed elements of mummy skin and had that skin examined. Essentially what he was looking for was the evidence of a high quantity of melanin or the absence of a high quantity of melanin. And that way we could work out, are we dealing with Negro skin or non-Negro skin? Diop suggested that all the mummies found at the Marietta excavations, all of them had Negro skin.
Cut.
The next thing then was UNESCO commissioned something called the General History of Africa. That took place in 1974. Now, the big stick...
Now, remember at this meeting, when they got put on front, when their lies were uncovered, they started talking about we're all humans. Let's not talk about race. All right? Which is typical. Same thing happens now when the truth comes out. Well, we're all God's creation. We're all God's people. No, we're not. Only the Israelites are God's people. Not even the other dark flesh. Not even the other melanated people are God's people. Only the Israelites.
The key point was going to be, where is ancient Egypt going to fit into these volumes, the General History of Africa? So they called the debate, and the debate was called the Cairo Symposium. And at that debate, two scholars presented a case
These two.
that the ancient Egyptians were Africans, and 18 scholars presented a case that the ancient Egyptians were Europeans, Asians, not Africans.
And they did become Edomites, so-called Europeans, but that's only after the conquering of Alexander of Macedon, who the world calls Alexander the Great, who is definitely an Edomite, so was the bulk of his armies, right? And he set up one of his generals over the melanated dark Egyptians, all right? So they take history from that time, you know, and try to make it as if they were there all along.
The two scholars, Professor Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Benga, won the argument. And if you read the General History of Africa, Volume 2, the debate is in there, and it's really, really funny. Just watching two people slaughter 18.
Must have been very embarrassing for them.
It's been so embarrassing that one would have...
And there was the Edomite woman, that Job 27:15. She was interviewing him. As a matter of fact, let's grab that. She said it must have been very embarrassing for them. Yeah, it was. They got proven to be liars. And he said the fragility of the whiteness, the fragility of their whiteness was on display. This is Job 27:15, and it reads, "Those that remain of him shall be buried in death, and his widows shall not weep." Everyone's tired of Esau, Edom, including his own women.
Expected that to be sort of common knowledge and someone to do a documentary about it and so on. But for obvious reasons, none of this has happened.
I guess that's our job to do.
Indeed.
She said, I guess that's our job to do. What? To put them on blast. History is a set of lies agreed upon. Napoleon Bonaparte, a bona fide Edomite. This is Jeremiah 49:10, and it reads, "But I have made Salakia. But I have made Esau bare. I have uncovered his secret places, and he shall not be able to hide himself. His seed is spoiled, and his brethren, and his neighbors, and he is not." All right. Also, before I check out, I just want to let everyone know that Malcolm and GMS Maccabean Spirit both have strikes on them. And so, you know, there'll be no videos put up on those for a while. So with that, all praises, glory, and honor be unto Yahweh, by Shem, Shai, by Hashem, Rakak, Wadash, Wa, Abba, Babal, Kwam, Yasharallah, and Shalom.